Hello, everyone. Have you ever seriously considered the possibility that a pivotal, war-starting event in your country's history was a complete fabrication, orchestrated by your own government? What if the evidence was so undeniable that it changed your perception of history forever? The year is 1962. A chill has settled over Washington, a cold that has nothing to do with the winter air. It's the icy dread of the Cold War, a paranoia that seeps through the cracks of every government building and whispers in the ear of every man in a position of power. The ghost of the Bay of Pigs fiasco haunts the halls of the White House, a constant, humiliating reminder of failure. President John F. Kennedy, young and charismatic but now politically wounded, feels the weight of the world, and specifically the weight of the small island nation just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. Cuba, under the fiery leadership of Fidel Castro, has become more than a nuisance. It is a bright red beacon of communism in America's backyard, a festering sore on the Monroe Doctrine. The CIA's covert attempts to dislodge Castro have been calamitous. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the uniformed titans of the American military machine, are growing impatient. They see surgical strikes and covert ops as weak, ineffective half-measures. They want war. They believe, with the certainty of men who command fleets and armies, that the only way to excise the Cuban cancer is with overwhelming military force. But they have a problem, a significant political hurdle. They lack a casus belli, a justifiable reason to invade. The American public and the world would never support an unprovoked assault on a sovereign nation, no matter how ideologically opposed. They need a pretext, an incident. Something so shocking, so undeniably an act of Cuban aggression, that it would galvanize public opinion and provide the moral high ground for invasion. In the sterile, smoke-filled conference rooms of the Pentagon, this problem is being tackled with chilling creativity. General Lyman L. Lemnitzer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man with a gaze as hard as granite, has tasked his best minds with a project of unparalleled audacity. It is not a plan for battle in the traditional sense, with troop movements and bombing runs. It is a plan for deception. A blueprint for theater on a national scale, where the stage is the continental United States and the actors are the American people themselves. The project is given a code name that sounds innocuous, almost pastoral: Operation Northwoods. The document itself, when finalized, will read less like a military strategy and more like a script for a dark political thriller. It is a catalogue of contrived horrors, a menu of manufactured atrocities designed to be blamed on Castro. The proposals are meticulously detailed. They speak of creating a Remember the Maine incident, a callback to the mysterious explosion that propelled the US into the Spanish-American War. They talk of orchestrating a terror campaign in the heart of Miami, targeting Cuban refugees and even American citizens, with bombings and riots that would be blamed on Cuban agents. They suggest developing a plausible Cuban communist terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington. The plan outlines sinking a boatload of Cuban refugees on the high seas, a tragedy that would be painted as a monstrous act by Castro's Navy. It details using a MiG-like aircraft, flown by a US pilot, to harass civil air, attack surface shipping, and destroy US military drone aircraft. Every detail is considered, every contingency planned for. The goal is simple and terrifying: to create a wave of righteous fury so powerful it would not just permit an invasion, but demand it. The men drafting this document are not monsters in their own eyes. They are patriots, acting in what they believe to be the best interests of their country. They see the Soviet threat as existential and Castro's Cuba as the tip of the spear aimed at America's throat. In their calculus, The sacrifice of a few, or even a few hundred innocent lives, is a justifiable price to pay for the security of millions and the eradication of a communist threat so close to home. The morality of the act is subsumed by the perceived necessity of the outcome. They are rolling the dice with the soul of their nation, and the plan is almost ready. It needs only one final signature to move from a theoretical exercise in asymmetrical warfare to a terrifying, active operation. The signature of the President of the United States. And as General Lemnitzer prepares to present his masterpiece of deceit, the question hangs in the air. Would the young, idealistic president, already burned by one Cuban misadventure, be willing to light the world on fire to save it? In the real world, he would reject it. But in the shadow history, in the story of what could have been, the pressure mounts, and a different, darker path is chosen. The document lands on the desk in the Oval Office. Its contents are poison waiting to be administered. The fate of countless lives, and the very concept of truth in government, rests on this single moment of decision. The air is thick with the smell of cigar smoke and impending doom. The meeting was held in the cabinet room, the polished mahogany table reflecting the grim faces of the men assembled. President Kennedy sat at the center, his expression a mask of strained composure. Opposite him was his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, his gaze sharp and skeptical. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, a man of numbers and systems, sat impassive, his slicked-back hair seeming to repel the tension in the room. And then there was General Lemnitzer, flanked by the other Joint Chiefs, his chest a constellation of ribbons. He was the conductor of this grim orchestra. The presentation began not with a bang, but with the dry, methodical click of a slide projector. The first slide was a map of Cuba, overlaid with red arrows and circles indicating strategic targets. Standard military briefing fare. But then the slides changed, and the nature of the meeting shifted from strategic to sinister. The title of the new section appeared in stark block letters: Pretexts to justify us military intervention in Cuba. A palpable silence descended on the room. Lemnitzer, in his clipped, authoritative voice, began to walk them through the plan. He spoke not of possibilities, but of certainties. We could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. This would be directed against Cuban refugees seeking haven in the United States. He detailed planting bombs in public places, framing innocent Cuban nationals, and fabricating evidence that would be leaked to the press. The president's jaw was tight, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the table. Bobby Kennedy shifted in his chair, a look of profound disgust crossing his features. McNamara remained a statue, processing, analyzing. The general was undeterred. Click. The next slide. We could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. He explained how they could stage a fake distress call, have US ships and aircraft appear on the scene too late, and recover survivors who were, in fact, trained US agents ready to give harrowing, scripted accounts of the attack by Cuban patrol boats. The cold-blooded nature of the proposal was staggering. It was the institutionalization of murder for political gain. But Lemnitzer had saved his masterstroke for last. A Remember the Maine incident could be arranged, he said, letting the historical weight of the phrase hang in the air. We could blow up a US ship in Guantanamo Bay and blame Cuba. He then outlined an even more elaborate and shocking deception. We could orchestrate an incident which will demonstrate convincingly that a Cuban aircraft has attacked and shot down a chartered civil airliner en route from the United States. He explained the chilling logistics. A real civilian flight, filled with passengers, would be filed on a flight plan from a US airbase to a destination in South America. At a designated point, the passenger aircraft would descend to minimum altitude and rendezvous with a drone, a remote-controlled replica of the same plane, painted with the same markings and a clone of its tail number. The real plane, filled with carefully vetted college students or other passengers under government control, would land at a secure airbase, its occupants whisked away in secrecy. The drone, meanwhile, would take its place, continuing on the filed flight plan. An aircraft at Eglin AFB would be painted and numbered as an exact duplicate for a civil registered aircraft belonging to a CIA proprietary organization in the Miami area. Lemnitzer read from his notes. The drone would be substituted for the actual aircraft and would be flight plan following on a path south of Florida. Then, over the Straits of Florida, the drone would broadcast a fake Mayday message, stating it was under attack by Cuban MiG fighters. The message would be cut off by a signal from the ground, triggering an explosion that would destroy the drone in a spectacular fireball. Search and rescue teams would be dispatched, and wreckage, pre-planted of course, would be discovered. The world would be presented with a horrifying, undeniable act of war. The murder of innocent American civilians by Castro's regime. In the real world, this was the moment Kennedy slammed his hand on the table, threw the generals out and told them the plan was insane. But in this timeline, the Bay of Pigs wasn't just a failure. It was a wound that had festered into a near-fatal infection of political vulnerability. The pressure from the military-industrial complex was immense. The whispers of him being soft on communism were growing louder. He saw the Soviet missiles that would soon be discovered in Cuba not as a future crisis, but as an inevitability he had to preempt. He looked at Lemnitzer, then at McNamara. He saw the cold logic in their eyes. He hated it. He hated them for bringing it to him. But he also saw it as a way out, a dark, treacherous path that led to a goal he desperately needed to achieve: the removal of the Soviet foothold in the Americas. "General," Kennedy said, his voice barely a whisper, breaking the suffocating silence. "If this is to be done, there can be no mistakes. Not one. The airliner. No real passengers. Agents only. The bombing in Miami. No American casualties. Is that understood?" Lemnitzer's expression didn't change, but a flicker of triumph showed in his eyes. He had his president. "Yes, Mr. President, it will be a clean operation. A fiction, but a convincing one." The decision was made. Operation Northwoods was no longer a theoretical paper. It was active. A secret, undeclared war against the truth had just begun, and the first shot would be fired not on the beaches of Cuba, but in the streets of Florida. The gears of the Leviathan began to turn, slowly and silently. The activation of Operation Northwoods was a secret held by fewer than a dozen men, a cancerous cell hidden within the body of the US government. The first phase was one of meticulous preparation, the clandestine assembly of a stage for a grand and terrible play. General Edward Lansdale, the legendary CIA operative and counterinsurgency expert, was brought in to oversee the on-the-ground execution. He was a master of the dark arts of psychological warfare, a man who understood that perception was more powerful than reality. His first task was to build the foundation of the lie in Miami. The city, a melting pot of sun-drenched optimism and simmering exile rage, was the perfect theater. Lansdale's teams, composed of deep-cover CIA agents and loyal military intelligence officers, began to move through the Cuban-American communities of Little Havana. They weren't there to recruit fighters. They were there to sow the seeds of a narrative. They operated through cutouts and front organizations, subtly funding the most radical and vocal anti-Castro groups. They didn't tell them to commit violence. They simply provided the resources and amplified the rhetoric, knowing that a spark in such a tinderbox was inevitable. They were creating a pool of plausible scapegoats. Simultaneously, a more sinister element was at work. A small, elite team of Army Special Forces operatives, men whose service records were so classified they barely existed, were smuggled into the city. These were not men for subtlety. They were experts in demolition and terror tactics. Their job was to be the enemy. They set up safe houses in nondescript suburbs, their basements slowly filling with caches of C4 plastic explosive, timers, and small arms, all of Soviet bloc origin, acquired through covert channels in Europe and painstakingly scrubbed of any link back to the United States. They studied maps of Miami, not for navigation, but for impact. They scouted locations, a crowded marketplace, a government building, a symbolic monument. They were ghosts preparing to haunt a city that didn't even know they were there. While Miami was being primed, another critical piece of the puzzle was being assembled at a secure, undisclosed location, likely Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle. In a guarded hangar, technicians and engineers worked around the clock on the star of the show, the drone. They had acquired a retired Douglas DC-7 airliner, a workhorse of a bygone era. Day by day, it was transformed. Its passenger seats were ripped out, replaced with racks of electronics and radio equipment. Its controls were wired into a complex remote piloting system. A special receiver was installed, linked to a high-yield explosive charge placed strategically near the wing's fuel tanks. This was the kill switch. The plane was meticulously painted in the livery of a fictional charter airline, a shell company established by the CIA just weeks earlier. The tail number, N329J, was stenciled on its fuselage and tail, a perfect clone of a real, active aircraft flying out of Miami. The plan was to have the real N329J, flown by CIA pilots, take off with its carefully selected passengers, military personnel on leave, instructed to pose as vacationing students, and then vanish from radar, landing secretly at a military auxiliary field while the drone took its place. The logistics were a nightmare of timing and precision, but failure was not an option. Far out in the Atlantic, a Navy submarine was given new, top-secret orders. It wasn't tasked with hunting Soviet subs. It was tasked with planting a specific type of debris field. Small, identifiable pieces of a Cuban MiG-19 fighter jet, also acquired through clandestine means, were to be scattered across a precise grid of ocean. This would be the proof found by search and rescue teams, corroborating the drone's final, desperate transmission. The web of deceit was expanding, each thread pulled by an unseen hand in Washington. The public, meanwhile, was being subtly prepared. News stories, planted by CIA assets in the media, began to appear, highlighting the brutality of the Castro regime and the growing desperation of Cuban exile groups. Op-eds penned by anonymous government officials warned of the potential for Cuban-sponsored terrorism on American soil. It was a gradual turning of the temperature, conditioning the public to accept the shock that was to come. In the Oval Office, Kennedy was a man tormented. He received daily sanitized briefings on the progress of Northwoods. He had justified it to himself as a necessary evil, a surgical strike on the truth to prevent a nuclear holocaust. But the weight of the lie was crushing. He found himself avoiding eye contact with his own reflection. He had authorized a plan to terrorize his own country. He had set a fire, and he knew with a sickening certainty that he would soon lose control of the flames. The pieces were in place. The actors were ready. The first scene was about to begin. All Lansdale's team needed was the final go order from the Pentagon. The date was set, a quiet Tuesday in late March, a day that would begin in sunshine and end in infamy. The go order came via a scrambled single-word transmission at 0400 hours. Showtime. In a quiet suburban house in Coral Gables, the leader of the Special Forces team, a man known only as Mr. Stone, crushed a cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. He looked at the three other men in the room, their faces illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp outside. They were professionals, their expressions calm and focused, but a taut energy filled the space. For weeks, they had been shadows. Tonight, they would become monsters. Their target was a small community center in Little Havana, a place known as a gathering spot for recently arrived Cuban refugees. It was a soft target, chosen for its symbolic value and its potential for maximum emotional impact. The plan was brutally simple. A briefcase containing 10 pounds of Soviet-made plastic explosive and a simple timer would be left in a trash receptacle near the main entrance. The narrative was already written. A factional dispute among the exiles, funded and armed by Castro's intelligence service, the DGI, to sow chaos and fear. It was a lie, but a plausible one, especially with the groundwork Lansdale's teams had already laid. The team moved out just after midnight, driving a nondescript Ford Falcon, its engine humming quietly in the humid night air. They wore civilian clothes, work shirts, jeans, blending in with the late-night traffic of a city that never fully slept. The driver navigated the streets with practiced ease, his knuckles not white, his gaze steady. The man in the passenger seat, Mr. Stone, held the briefcase on his lap. It was heavy, a dead weight of destructive potential. They parked a block away from the community center. The street was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city and the chirping of crickets. Stone and one other operative, a wiry man named Snake, got out. They walked at a leisurely pace, two men heading home after a late shift. As they approached the center, a single light burned over the doorway. Stone paused, scanned the street one last time, then nodded to Snake. Snake casually walked to the trash can, lifted the lid, and Stone placed the briefcase inside. The timer was already set for 2:15 a.m., an hour when the streets would be deserted, minimizing the chance of witnesses but ensuring the blast would be heard for miles. The act took less than 10 seconds. They turned and walked away, not looking back, their pace unchanged. They were back in the car and pulling away from the curb before their heartbeats had a chance to quicken. At precisely 2:15 a.m., a blinding white flash momentarily turned night into day in that small corner of Little Havana. It was followed an instant later by a deafening roar that shattered windows for 3 blocks in every direction. The front of the community center disintegrated, a storm of concrete, wood, and glass erupting into the street. The shockwave rolled through the neighborhood, shaking houses and rattling the nerves of a sleeping populace. Within minutes, the first sirens began their frantic wail, converging on the scene. Chaos descended. Police cars and fire trucks flooded the area, their flashing lights painting the smoke-filled street in strobing blues and reds. Hysterical residents, thrown from their beds, poured out of their homes, shouting in a mixture of Spanish and English. The air was thick with the acrid smell of explosives and burning debris. The media arrived almost as quickly as the first responders. Reporters, alerted by anonymous tips that were in fact calls made by Lansdale's assets, were already on the scene, their cameras capturing the devastation. By sunrise, the story was leading every news broadcast in the country. "Terror in Miami," the headlines screamed. "Bombing rocks Cuban exile community." The FBI was immediately dispatched, and before the dust had even settled, the narrative began to take shape. An FBI spokesman, carefully briefed by a liaison from the Department of Defense, announced the discovery of foreign-made explosive materials at the scene. He spoke of credible intelligence, suggesting infiltration of exile groups by Castro's agents. In the community itself, the seeds of paranoia planted by Lansdale's teams began to sprout. Accusations flew. Old rivalries flared. The chaos and division were exactly as planned. In Washington, President Kennedy watched the coverage from the Oval Office, his face ashen. He had known this was coming. He had authorized it. But seeing the raw, real-life footage of the destruction, the fear on the faces of the people, made it sickeningly tangible. This was no longer an abstract concept on a piece of paper. This was real. He had blood on his hands, even if the official casualty report, by some miracle of timing and luck, listed only 3 injuries and no fatalities. The first domino had fallen. Public opinion, once hesitant, began to harden against Castro. The calls for action grew louder. The story of a peaceful sleeping city attacked by foreign terrorists resonated deeply with the American psyche. The Pentagon's plan was working perfectly, but this was only the beginning. The bombing was designed to set a mood of fear and anger. The next act, according to the Northwoods script, had to be one of tragedy, a crime so heinous it would cry out for vengeance. The eyes of the planners now turned from the land to the sea. The stage was set for an even more terrible illusion, one that would play out in the deep, dark waters of the Florida Straits. The public anger over the Miami bombing was a fire stoked daily by calculated leaks and inflammatory press coverage. The narrative of Cuban-sponsored terror on US soil was now firmly established. It was time for Phase 2 of Operation Northwoods, an act designed to transform that anger into righteous fury. The plan was codenamed Lost Souls, a descriptor of chilling accuracy. It called for the sinking of a boat of Cuban refugees, a spectacle of inhumanity to be laid squarely at Castro's feet. The vessel chosen was an old, rickety fishing trawler named the Esperanza, or Hope. The CIA had purchased it weeks before through a front company. It was barely seaworthy, which made it perfect for the role it was about to play. The refugees were a group of a dozen individuals, a mix of deep-cover CIA agents and a few genuinely desperate Cuban exiles who had been duped into participating. They were told they were part of a highly classified mission to extract high-value political prisoners from a coastal town in Cuba. They were promised new lives and substantial payment for their families. They were pawns, their trust and patriotism weaponized against them. The plan was for the Esperanza to set sail from a small, secluded key south of Miami, broadcasting its supposed departure from Cuban waters. Its course would take it directly into the busy shipping lanes of the Florida Straits. A U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Gudgeon, had been shadowing the area for days, its crew given sealed orders to be opened only upon a coded signal. Their mission was not to rescue, but to observe and, if necessary, to ensure there were no unexpected witnesses. Another team of operatives was stationed on a rescue ship, a Coast Guard cutter named the Vigilant, which was pre-positioned just over the horizon. The agents on this ship had a different, more ghoulish task. They were to play the part of the distraught survivors. They had been coached for weeks, their backstories memorized, their expressions of grief and terror rehearsed to perfection. On a moonless night, the Esperanza slipped its moorings and chugged out into the open sea. Its radio operator, a CIA communications expert, began broadcasting a series of pre-scripted messages in Spanish, creating the illusion of a desperate flight from Cuba. He spoke of rough seas and a fear of being pursued by Cuban patrol boats. For hours, the small boat pitched and rolled in the dark swells. The mood on board was tense. The genuine exiles were nervous but hopeful, believing they were on a heroic mission. The agents among them were quiet, their minds focused on the grim task ahead. The go signal came just before dawn. It was a simple, encrypted radio burst. The senior agent on board the Esperanza gave a quiet nod to his team. The plan was for scuttling charges, placed earlier along the keel to be detonated, sinking the ship quickly but not instantly. It had to look like it was torpedoed or hit by naval gunfire. However, something went terribly wrong. The sea was rougher than anticipated. As the first scuttling charge was being armed, a massive rogue wave slammed into the trawler's beam, throwing the man and the explosive against the bulkhead. The device detonated prematurely, tearing a huge, jagged hole in the ship's side below the waterline. Seawater rushed in with terrifying force. The ship lurched violently, chaos erupting on deck. There was no time for a staged evacuation, no time for life rafts. The Esperanza began to capsize almost immediately, its old timbers groaning in protest. The lights flickered and died, plunging the scene into absolute darkness, broken only by the panicked shouts of the men on board. The agents, trained for crisis, fought to get to the surface, but the genuine exiles, caught completely by surprise, were trapped below deck. They had been promised a mission, a new life. Instead, they were delivered to a cold, watery grave, victims of a deception they never understood. The USS Gudgeon, listening on sonar, registered the explosion and the sickening sound of the hull collapsing. Its captain, following his orders, recorded the event in his log as unidentified underwater explosion and remained submerged, a silent, steel witness. A few miles away, the rescue cutter, Vigilant, received its cue. It raced towards the last known position of the Esperanza. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the Vigilant arrived on the scene. The ocean was littered with a small field of debris. There were no survivors to be found from the actual Esperanza. The agents who had been aboard the Vigilant all along now went into action. They smeared themselves with oil and jumped into the water, clinging to pieces of wreckage. When the press helicopters, conveniently alerted by an anonymous maritime source, arrived on the scene, they captured dramatic footage of the Coast Guard pulling these sole survivors from the water. The story that unfolded was horrific. The agents, posing as grief-stricken refugees, gave harrowing, tearful accounts to the media. They spoke of being hunted by a Cuban gunboat, of a merciless, unprovoked attack in the dead of night. They described watching their friends and family drown in the cold sea. Their performances were flawless, their trauma utterly convincing. The news exploded across the world. Castro's atrocity at sea, blared the headlines. The sinking of a defenseless refugee boat was an act of barbarism that shocked the global conscience. International condemnation rained down on Cuba. In the United Nations, the US ambassador presented the eyewitness testimony as undeniable proof of the Cuban regime's inhumanity. The Miami bombing had created anger. The sinking of the Esperanza created pure, unadulterated hatred. The American public was now baying for blood. The moral justification for war was almost complete. All that was needed now was the final, unforgivable act, an attack not on refugees, but on innocent American civilians. The drone in the hangar at Eglin Air Force Base was ready for its one and only flight. The public fury was a tidal wave, and the Kennedy administration rode it with grim determination. The Lost Souls incident had painted Castro as a monster, and the world was now watching, waiting for America's response. The final act of Operation Northwoods was designed to be the breaking point, an event so outrageous it would make military intervention not just an option, but a moral imperative. The plan, once a chilling proposal on paper, was now a meticulously rehearsed reality. On the morning of the operation, a chartered Douglas DC-7, tail number N329J, sat on the tarmac at a civilian airport near Homestead, Florida. Its flight plan was filed for a journey to Caracas, Venezuela. The passenger manifest was a fabrication of innocence, a list of 38 college students from a university in Ohio, supposedly on a study abroad trip. In reality, the students were all unmarried, junior military officers and intelligence agents, all volunteers who understood they were participating in a classified mission of national importance. They had been briefed to act naturally, to carry luggage, to laugh and chat as they boarded the plane. From a distance, it was a picture of youthful excitement. The flight crew were seasoned CIA pilots, their nerves steady, their minds focused on a checklist far more complex than a standard pre-flight inspection. As the real N329J taxied for takeoff, its duplicate, the drone, was being prepared for launch at a remote airstrip at Eglin AFB, hundreds of miles to the northwest. The two aircraft were electronic twins set to follow intersecting paths. The real flight took off and headed south over the Caribbean. The mood inside was quiet and professional, a stark contrast to the outward appearance of a holiday flight. The passengers didn't read magazines. They monitored secure communication channels. An hour into the flight, as the plane flew over a sparsely populated area of the Caribbean, the pilot initiated the swap. He descended rapidly, dropping below the coverage of civilian air traffic control radar. At the same time, the drone, which had been flying a parallel course, was guided into the same flight path, taking the place of the real aircraft on the radar screens of controllers in Miami and Havana. It was a seamless electronic handoff. The real N329J, now flying under a different classified transponder code, banked sharply to the west, heading for a secret landing at a covert CIA airbase in Central America, its mission to disappear. The drone, now officially N329J, climbed back to the designated altitude and continued on the filed flight plan towards Cuba. Inside a windowless command bunker at Eglin, a pilot sat at a console, a bank of screens and controls in front of him. He was flying a Ghost, guiding the empty airliner on its final journey. Another team of specialists stood by at a communications panel ready to broadcast the final, terrifying transmission. As the drone entered the airspace north of Cuba, the command was given. The communications specialist, his voice strained with practiced fear, began transmitting on the international distress frequency. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Charter N329J. We are under attack. Repeat, we are under attack by Cuban MiGs. We are on fire. We are going down." The transmission was deliberately amateurish, filled with panicked breaths and the sound of simulated alarms, all designed for maximum authenticity. The message was broadcast for exactly 30 seconds before another operator in the bunker pushed a single red button. A signal shot across the sky to the drone. The receiver connected to the explosive charge aboard the aircraft acknowledged the command. High over the azure waters of the Florida Straits, the drone's left wing erupted in a massive fireball. The explosion tore the aircraft apart, sending flaming pieces of metal tumbling into the ocean below. On radar screens in Miami, the blip that was N329J simply vanished. The Mayday call had been heard by dozens of other aircraft and maritime radio operators. Within minutes, the news was flashing across wire services. An American civilian airliner had been shot down. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. The carefully constructed facade of provocation had achieved its ultimate goal. The story was a firestorm. It was one thing to attack refugees at sea. It was another entirely to shoot down a plane full of American college students in cold blood. It was the modern-day sinking of the Lusitania, an act of unforgivable aggression. The US Navy and Coast Guard launched a massive search and rescue operation, which was in reality a recovery mission for the pre-planted debris of the Cuban MiG fighter. Within hours, they announced the discovery of wreckage consistent with a Soviet-made aircraft, miles from the airliner's last known position. The evidence, though entirely fabricated, was presented as irrefutable. In Washington, President Kennedy addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His face was a mask of sorrow and grim resolve. He spoke of an unprovoked and cowardly act of war against the United States. He detailed the pattern of aggression from the bombing in Miami to the sinking of the Esperanza, culminating in this massacre in the sky. His voice, filled with controlled rage, resonated with a nation that was now united in grief and a desire for retribution. "I have asked the Congress," he said, his eyes boring into the camera lens, "and they have granted the authority to use all necessary force to respond to these attacks and to protect the security of our nation and this hemisphere. There would be no more covert ops, no more sanctions." The time for talk was over. The lie had been told, the trap had been sprung, and the full, terrifying might of the United States military was now poised to unleash hell on the island of Cuba. The manufactured casus belli was complete. War was no longer a possibility. It was an immediate and terrible certainty. The ghosts of Northwoods were about to be joined by the ghosts of a very real and bloody conflict. The declaration of war was a formality. The heart of the nation, fueled by a potent cocktail of grief and government-sponsored propaganda, had already made its decision. The congressional vote was nearly unanimous, a rare moment of bipartisan unity forged in a crucible of lies. The world watched, with a mixture of apprehension and tacit approval. The evidence presented by the United States, the wreckage of the MiG, the harrowing eyewitness accounts, the final desperate Mayday call, appeared overwhelming. Cuba was isolated, condemned as a pariah state run by a bloodthirsty madman. The speed of the American military mobilization was breathtaking, a testament to a machine that had been waiting for this moment. Within 48 hours of Kennedy's address, the skies over Florida were thick with the roar of C-130 transport planes and B-52 bombers. The ports of Norfolk and Key West emptied as the Atlantic Fleet steamed south, a gray armada of carriers, destroyers, and amphibious assault ships. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were placed on immediate deployment status. It was the largest American military operation since the Korean War. Secretary of Defense McNamara, the architect of numbers, became the face of the war effort. In daily press briefings at the Pentagon, he stood before maps and charts, methodically laying out the indisputable case against Castro and the surgical nature of the US response. He spoke of Operation Freedom's Fury, a name carefully chosen to resonate with the public mood. He presented satellite photos, some real, some doctored, of Cuban military installations, emphasizing the threat they posed. He was cool, confident, and utterly convincing. The truth of Operation Northwoods was buried under an avalanche of manufactured evidence and official pronouncements. The few dissenting voices were quickly silenced. Journalists who questioned the official timeline or the convenient discovery of evidence found their access to sources cut off. Their editors, under immense political and public pressure, shelved their stories. A handful of foreign governments, primarily in the Soviet bloc, decried the American aggression as a fabrication, but their protests were dismissed as predictable communist propaganda. The machine of public consent was working at peak efficiency. Inside the White House, the atmosphere was one of grim, focused activity. The men who had conceived the lie were now forced to manage its consequences. General Lemnitzer and the Joint Chiefs finally had the war they had always wanted. Their initial plan called for a massive aerial bombardment followed by a full-scale amphibious invasion near Havana. President Kennedy, however, still haunted by the specter of the lie he had authorized, reined them in. He insisted on a more limited initial engagement focusing on airstrikes against Cuban airfields and military command centers, coupled with a naval blockade to prevent any potential Soviet reinforcement. He was trying to control a fire he had started, hoping to achieve his strategic goal, the removal of Castro, without igniting a global conflict. The first wave of strikes came at dawn on the third day. U.S. Navy jets, launched from the decks of the USS Enterprise and USS Forrestal, screamed across the Florida Straits. They met with surprisingly stiff resistance. The Cuban military, while small, was well-trained and fiercely motivated, fighting for their homeland against what they saw as a naked act of imperialist aggression. The initial American casualty reports were higher than the Pentagon had predicted, a sobering reminder that war, even one started with a lie, has a very real and bloody price. The propaganda war raged alongside the real one. The US broadcast radio and television signals into Cuba, urging citizens to rise up against Castro and promising liberation. On the home front, the media portrayed American soldiers as heroes and liberators, fighting to free the Cuban people from tyranny. The faces of the murdered students from Flight N329J were displayed on magazine covers, their fabricated stories serving as a national rallying cry. The 38 officers and agents who had played the part of the students were now living in a state of gilded captivity at a secure base, their mission complete, but their freedom forfeit. They were ghosts, living casualties of a war they had helped to start, their real identities erased to protect the foundational lie. In just a few short days, the world had been irrevocably changed. A sovereign nation was under attack. American soldiers were dying, and it was all based on an elaborate and monstrous deception. The men of Operation Northwoods had proven that a lie, if big enough and told with enough conviction, could indeed launch a war. But as the invasion ground on and the casualties mounted, a new and terrifying question began to form in the minds of the few who knew the truth. What happens when the lie begins to unravel? The foundation of the war was built on a sinkhole, and even the slightest crack could cause the entire edifice of justification to collapse, swallowing everyone and everything with it. The short, victorious war the Pentagon had promised was turning into a bloody slog, and the truth was a time bomb ticking beneath it all. The war in Cuba was short, but brutal. The initial resistance, while spirited, was ultimately no match for the overwhelming technological and numerical superiority of the United States military. Within 3 weeks, American tanks were rolling through the streets of Havana. Fidel Castro and his top commanders, including Che Guevara, retreated to the Sierra Maestra Mountains, the same peaks from which their revolution had been born, to wage a guerrilla war. A provisional pro-American government, composed of carefully selected Cuban exiles, was installed in the capital. The war was officially declared over. Mission accomplished, the headlines read. To the American public, it was a resounding victory, a righteous triumph over a brutal dictator, and a decisive blow against communism in the Western Hemisphere. The relatively low number of American casualties, just under 2,000 killed in action, was considered a small price to pay for securing the nation's backyard. The lie of Operation Northwoods was cemented as historical fact, a chapter in the heroic narrative of the Cold War, but lies, especially those of such magnitude, have a way of poisoning everything they touch. The secret was a cancer in the heart of the men who kept it. President Kennedy, though publicly lauded as a strong, decisive leader, was privately a broken man. The weight of the deception and the blood of the soldiers who died for it wore him down. His public appearances became less frequent, his youthful vigor replaced by a haunted, weary expression. He had won the war, but lost a part of his soul. The architects of the plan, men like Lemnitzer and Lansdale, retired with honors, their careers crowned by a secret monstrous success. They would take the truth to their graves, believing to the end that they had done what was necessary to protect America. For years, the secret held. The world moved on. The Vietnam War soon overshadowed the brief, bloody conflict in Cuba. The island nation became a de facto American protectorate, a tropical paradise for tourism and business interests, but a place of simmering resentment and insurgency in the hills. The official history was taught in schools and written in textbooks. Flight N329J was a national tragedy, a symbol of American innocence lost to foreign evil. The Miami bombing and the sinking of the Esperanza were footnotes in the righteous justification for war, but truth is patient. It waits in dusty archives, in the troubled memories of aging men, in the loose threads of a story that is just a little too perfect. The first crack appeared in the late 1970s. A disgruntled retired CIA officer, a man who had worked on the logistical side of the drone program at Eglin, began talking. Plagued by alcoholism and guilt, he confided in a young, ambitious journalist. He didn't have the whole picture, but he had pieces. A drone painted to look like a civilian airliner, a faked flight plan, a simulated Mayday call. The journalist, a man named David Eckert, spent 2 years chasing the ghost of a story. He was met with stonewalls at every turn. The official records were sealed. The names on the flight manifest led to dead ends, and his inquiries at the Pentagon were met with thinly veiled threats. He was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. His own editors refused to publish his initial findings, fearing lawsuits and government retribution. The story was too big, too monstrous to be believed. But Eckert was relentless. He cross-referenced old flight logs, interviewed retired air traffic controllers, and tracked down family members of the victims of Flight N329J, only to find that there were no grieving families, no parents, no siblings. The students on that plane seemed to have appeared from a void and vanished without a trace. The official story was that they were orphans or had no close relatives, a statistical improbability that gnawed at Eckert. The next piece fell into place in the early 1980s. One of the Special Forces operatives from the Miami bombing team, now dying of cancer, sought a priest for a final confession. The priest, bound by the sanctity of the confessional but horrified by what he heard, contacted a human rights lawyer and spoke in hypotheticals. The lawyer, sensing something more, began his own quiet investigation, eventually connecting with Eckert. The threads were beginning to connect. The story was no longer just about a downed plane. It was about a domestic terror attack, orchestrated by the US government itself. The picture emerging was of a conspiracy so vast, so profound, that it defied comprehension. Eckert and the lawyer began working in secret, compiling a dossier of circumstantial evidence, anonymous testimony, and troubling inconsistencies. They knew they were treading on dangerous ground. The men who had orchestrated Northwoods were old or dead, but the institution that had spawned it, the national security state, was more powerful than ever. It had a vested interest in keeping its skeletons locked away. The lie had held for 2 decades, but the foundation was cracking. The truth was slowly, inexorably clawing its way to the surface, threatening to rewrite a crucial chapter of American history and shatter the nation's trust in the very institutions designed to protect it. The time bomb was ticking faster now, and the world was completely unaware that the history they knew was about to detonate. The tipping point came in 1988, not with a bang, but with the quiet hum of a declassification process. A low-level archivist at the National Archives, working through a backlog of recently declassified Pentagon documents from the Kennedy era, stumbled upon a file stamped TSSCI, Top Secret Sensitive Compartmented Information. The file was thin, its cover starkly titled, Justification for U.S. Military Intervention in Cuba. The archivist, a meticulous history buff named Arthur Finch, expected to find strategic assessments or contingency plans. Instead, as he read the first page, the blood drained from his face. The document wasn't a plan. It was a script. It detailed in cold bureaucratic language a series of proposed pretext operations. It spoke of a terror campaign in Miami, of sinking a boat of refugees, of manufacturing a Remember the Maine incident. And then he saw it. A section so chilling it made him feel physically ill. It was a detailed proposal for staging the shoot-down of a civilian airliner using a drone substitute to be blamed on Cuba. The project's name was at the top of the memorandum, Operation Northwoods. Finch sat back in his chair, the silence of the archive pressing in on him. He was holding the blueprint for the war. The official story, the one he had learned in school and accepted his entire life, was a lie. This document was the Rosetta Stone of a generation-defining conspiracy. He knew what he was holding. It was more than a historical curiosity. It was a weapon. He also knew that officially releasing it would be impossible. The declassified stamp was likely a mistake, an oversight by a censor who hadn't understood the document's earth-shattering significance. If he followed protocol, the file would be immediately reclassified and buried forever. He made a decision that would change his life and his country's history. He spent the next hour discreetly photocopying every page. That night, he contacted David Eckert. The meeting took place in a dimly lit booth in an all-night diner. Finch, visibly terrified, slid a manila envelope across the table. Eckert opened it and began to read. For 20 years, he had been chasing shadows, piecing together whispers and fragments. Now here it was, in black and white, on official Department of Defense letterhead, signed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was the truth, stark and irrefutable. It was the playbook for the events of 1962. Eckert knew this was the story of the century, but also the most dangerous one. He teamed up with a major television news network, one with the resources and legal firepower to withstand the coming storm. For months, they worked in total secrecy, verifying every detail in the Northwoods document against Eckert's own 2 decades of research. They found the retired air traffic controller who remembered the bizarre radar handoff. They found a former Navy crewman from the USS Gudgeon who confessed to logging a phantom explosion the night the Esperanza went down. They even located one of the student agents from Flight N329J, an old man living under an assumed name in Oregon, who, when presented with the evidence, broke down and confirmed the entire operation. The broadcast was a 2-hour primetime special, simply titled The Northwoods File. It began with a solemn anchor looking into the camera and saying, "What you are about to see will challenge everything you believe about a pivotal moment in American history." The program methodically laid out the evidence, the declassified document, the interviews with whistleblowers, the side-by-side comparison of the Pentagon's plan and the historical events. It was a journalistic bombshell. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The government's first reaction was denial. A Pentagon spokesman called the document a forgery and the story a baseless and irresponsible smear. But the evidence was too strong. The network released the full authenticated Northwoods document online, and it spread like wildfire. A congressional investigation was launched, a modern-day church committee, but this time the secrets were already out. The hearings were a national spectacle. Aging generals and CIA officials were subpoenaed, forced to testify under oath. Some lied, committing perjury. Others invoked the Fifth Amendment. A few, faced with the undeniable truth of the documents, confessed. The testimony painted a horrifying picture of a government that had willingly terrorized and deceived its own people to achieve a military objective. The trust between the American people and their government, already frayed by Vietnam and Watergate, was shattered. The revelation sent shockwaves through the nation's psyche. The Cuban War, once a source of patriotic pride, was now seen as a national shame. The monuments to its heroes became symbols of a monstrous lie. The families of the nearly 2,000 soldiers who died in the conflict demanded answers, their grief now compounded by a sense of profound betrayal. Their sons and husbands had died not for freedom, but for a fabrication. The very concept of truth in government seemed to collapse. If the state could orchestrate such a massive deception, what else was a lie? Every official statement, every historical event was now viewed through a lens of deep, corrosive cynicism. The Northwoods file didn't just rewrite history, it poisoned the well of national identity, leaving a legacy of distrust and paranoia that would linger for generations. The lie had finally come home to roost, and the cost was the faith of a nation in itself. The legacy of Operation Northwoods was not one of closure, but of a wound that would not heal. The congressional hearings concluded with a damning report that confirmed the core allegations of the deception, but it offered little solace. The primary architects were long dead, beyond the reach of justice. The few living lower-level participants were granted immunity for their testimony, leaving a nation hungry for accountability with no one to punish. The provisional government in Cuba, propped up for decades by the US, collapsed in the wake of the scandal, leading to a new period of civil strife and instability on the island. The revelation had undone the very victory the lie was created to achieve, rendering the entire conflict a pointless, tragic exercise in deceit. In the United States, the cultural and political fallout was immense. The term Northwoods entered the lexicon as shorthand for the ultimate government conspiracy, the benchmark against which all other theories were measured. It fueled a deep-seated distrust of authority that reshaped American politics. Mainstream trust in institutions like the military, the intelligence community, and the executive branch plummeted to historic lows. This widespread cynicism created fertile ground for misinformation and partisan division, as people no longer had a shared baseline of truth to rely upon. The very fabric of civic discourse became frayed. For the families of the soldiers killed in the Cuban War, the truth was an unbearable burden. Their loved ones had not died defending their country from a foreign aggressor. They had been sacrificed for a lie. A national memorial in Arlington that had been erected in their honor became a site of protest rather than remembrance. The names carved in marble were no longer just casualties of war, but victims of a state-sponsored murder plot. The phrase, "died for a lie," became a bitter refrain, a ghost that haunted the conscience of the nation. The historical community was thrown into turmoil. Decades of scholarship had to be rewritten. The presidency of John F. Kennedy, once viewed through the prism of Camelot and Cold War bravery, was now re-examined under a much darker light. Was he a reluctant participant, a weak leader pushed into an unthinkable act by a hawkish military? Or was he a colder, more ruthless pragmatist than history had ever imagined? The debate raged, turning a once revered figure into a symbol of a nation's lost innocence. The story of Northwoods became a cautionary tale, a brutal lesson in the dangers of unchecked power and the seductive logic of necessary evils. It raised fundamental questions about the nature of democracy in a national security state. How much secrecy is too much? When does protecting a nation become a pretext for betraying its core values? These questions hung over every subsequent foreign policy debate and military intervention. The world, too, looked at America differently. The nation that had long preached about freedom, democracy, and the rule of law was now exposed as having used the tactics of a totalitarian regime against its own people. Its moral authority on the world stage was crippled for a generation. The story's end was not a neat resolution. It was a messy, open-ended erosion of faith. The final scene in this dark chapter of history was not a verdict or a judgment, but a lingering, poisonous question that embedded itself in the American mind. If they could do this and hide it for so long, what else have they done? What other truths are buried in classified archives? What other historical events rest on a foundation of lies? The revelation of Operation Northwoods didn't just expose a single conspiracy. It suggested the possibility of countless others, leaving the nation to forever wonder what is real and what is theater, forever peering into the shadows, searching for the next great deception. The silence from the government was, in its own way, the most terrifying answer of all.